when you go out into the world and you ask somebody for something as precious as the story about how much they love their mom, like that might be the biggest gift they could give their community. So what can you do to demonstrate your worthiness to receive that gift and to help them give it?
Welcome to the Storycraft podcast for storytellers. I'm your host, Meg Adams, and I'm here to help you explore how stories shape our connections. Wondering how stories help you network and advance? Looking to bridge online and face-to-face worlds, foster understanding, and ignite innovation? Look no further. Whether you're a leader, communicator, educator, or just love a good story, join us for actionable insights and real talk with professional storytellers, all aimed at helping you build stronger, better connections. I was on your website, and I wanted to start our conversation with this. Your headline on your website says, "I'm a professional listener who loves to talk. It's complicated." And I love that, and I was just hoping we could start there. You could explain that listening piece. Why did you write that headline?
Oh, okay. Because to be a great journalist, you must be a great listener, right? Like the whole job is listening. And it's listening for what someone's saying. It's listening for what they're not saying. It's listening to a million people, right? If you read, and sometimes the New York Times, I think they do a really good job at being transparent in their journalism. And in the last few years, they've started to write things like, we interviewed more than 100 people for this story. Or, we combed through more than 300 pages of public documents or something, right? Like, so they're trying to show you the work. And I think that's a way of, reading, it's all that's a way of listening. And I think the public perception of journalists is that they're like always talking, but they're only talking or writing at the end of the process. And that might only represent like 10%, 30% of the total work. Eli Saslow just had a front page story last weekend about the homelessness crisis in Phoenix. And I read it because I was like, obviously interested. I live in Phoenix. I live about a mile from the physical location that the story was set in. My neighbors are, unsheltered. And he wrote that he spent more than like 40 hours reporting that story. Like, and you think like that's a whole week of work just on this one thing. And I thought even then I was like, that still seemed low for a story that good, but I'm sure he's very fast now. He's like very talented, so I'm sure he's fast. But so you listen all the time. To be a great story coach, similarly, right? You have to listen, and you have to listen differently than as a journalist, because you have to also listen for like your spidey sense of like, is this person, in my line of work where we're always producing shows for the public, I'm like, is this person safe to tell the story? Is this person going to like ruin their relationship with someone if they tell this story? Is this person going to get themselves fired if they tell the story? So you're like not just listening for like the facts of the story and like what order should we put them in, or would it be better if we started the story here or started the story there? But I'm also literally listening for, and when I onboard people into the coaching process, I tell them, I'm listening for you saying these things, and so you don't have to worry about it. I will hear it, and then I'll flag it for you. If you say something that feels like it's going to be harmful to your reputation, the reputation of someone else, or is going to inhibit your ability to connect with the audience.
Absolutely. And I just think that's I appreciated that from you, because I think that like a lot of times we focus on the storytelling and not that listening piece, especially as storytellers. You're talking about story coaching, but I think like too listening to ourselves to tell the story, right? We have to be good listeners. I'm going to backtrack a little bit, Megan, and ask just for listeners too, tell us about your career as a storyteller.
Oh, yeah. So I started out, I knew I wanted to be a journalist when I was 15. And then I have been. So I also thought it would be easier. I didn't know, that industry I would love would go through like such contractions, but God willing, I'm still a full-time reporter or full-time journalist. I'm not a reporter every day anymore. But so I was an editor and reporter at the Arizona Republic, and then in 2011, I founded in that newsroom storytelling collective modeled on the Moth, but informed by our news judgment. So, excuse me, the key difference is like our stories always have to be like in service to the community by highlighting or celebrating some universal value, and they're not like folk tales, or they're not kind of like funny stories. Like, and we've had people pitch us stories. They're like, the craziest thing happened, and you're like, but what did you learn or how did you change? And then
Right.
they don't always, there's something right or
Sure.
so that started in 2011, and then I took it national in 2016, where I was able to like take the best practices out of our Phoenix newsroom, turn it into like a rigorous process, and then we rolled it out. Ultimately, more than about 25 newsrooms ended up participating from 2016 to 2022 to do that. And then in 2022, I left Gannett, and now I still work as a story curation expert and coach. And like I'm working on a show right now for PBS in Arizona, like helping with stories from the stage out of WBUR in Boston. So that's what I do.
That's so cool. You know, I love
Thank you.
to meet people, and like the career journey for people is so interesting. And I'll tell you what, Megan, as storytellers, it's interesting that most people I talk to start out either in journalism school or in like a small newsroom. So it's been really neat to see how people are taking those skills and connecting them elsewhere. And so I think your path is just really interesting. So you, correct me if I'm wrong, you focus a lot on oral storytelling, right? So like getting up on stage and telling your story.
Yes.
Okay, great. What have you learned about building community and sharing stories publicly? Well, let's start with like the basic building blocks of building relationships and connections, like through storytelling. How have you seen that happen in your work?
Okay, so a couple things, like specifically like through the lens of like civic storytelling, which is kind of how I am conceive of the work I've done, because it's always like I'm attached to an institution, right? So like a media organization, or I'm there on behalf of like a big nonprofit or something. And so the first thing I had to deal with or understand about my role in the ecosystem was that people have preconceived notions about these institutions because maybe they didn't cover that community accurately, fairly, or appropriately. Maybe they mishandled a topic area, like, right, like most big civic institutions have legacies of harm.
Yeah. Yeah.
Sorry, like kind of a big
No, I know. Well,
terrible,
I think
like,
it's
true,
not.
right?
I appreciate that your honesty and bluntness there, because that is such a precursor, right? I appreciate that from you, and helping us understand like how storytelling can work for better, right?
Yeah, right. So like, so it's not all like kumbaya. Like you're not just like, hey, you want to tell a story?
Sure.
So to do the work, you have to like be prepared to, you don't have to, you didn't do the harm, but you can apologize for it. You can say on behalf of the institution, it would have been way better if we had like stood up for your community when that freeway was getting built through it, but we didn't, because those bosses 70 years ago were part of the ruling class that was benefited by that freeway, and whatever, right? Like I'm just figuring like coming through the front door, right? So so the first thing you have to do to like actually build community is you have to like understand what are like the barriers to this community existing at all. And so the first one might be total mistrust, like decades long hostility. Like I'm making it sound bad, but like people who want to be nice to you are going to be nice to you.
Yeah,
Sorry,
absolutely. No, I was going to say, just to clarify, we're talking about when you're going out and you're working with the institution, is it mainly like journalists that you're working with, or when you're speaking about like going out and you're talking, or is it like corporate institutions, government institutions when you do your storytelling work?
Sorry.
Yeah, no, that's fine.
Well, so in my previous role, we were all these newsrooms going out into the communities, inviting everyday people to tell stories. And so what I'm kind of speaking to is like, to create trust, you have to, so to really build community, we have this like really elaborate coaching process that like starts with, these are my roles and expectations that you can have of me. These are my expectations of you. You can drop out of the process basically until I call your name onto stage. Like that was also one of our guidelines, was like a person could just drop out at any point. It does not matter. Like they know what's best. Even if I've invested all these hours in you, it still might not be right for you to do it on a Tuesday. And so you can just not do it. So we have this like fairly long and elaborate, super rigorous coaching process guided by a bunch of key values that are rooted in keeping everyone emotionally safe and upholding the integrity of the news organization and any of its partners. But to actually create community and healing or catharsis, the first thing was like getting people to trust us truly on like a one-on-one basis, right? Like,
Sure.
so when I was sort of saying like, first you might have to apologize, or you have to be like aware of the role or position your institution is playing in a community. I think that's true for all of us as story coaches or facilitators or curators, is like who you are, what you look like, the institution that paid you to be there or is hosting the event, like all those aspects of your identity have pros and cons or baggage, or they have meaning to the people you're about to work with. And it's important for you to be aware of the meaning of those things and to take responsibility for them. And so I don't want to sound like I'm an apologist for the newsrooms, because like they were doing the best they could at the time. I'm just saying like people are holding us to a standard now of consciousness. And so it is good to understand like, people are going to turn you down, or they're not going to trust you, or they're going to be like, what are you going to do with my story later? How are you going to extract wealth and resources from my material? Right. And I had to be able to answer those questions. Like, we're not. Or people be like, well, you guys have sponsorship. And I'd be like, yeah, it keeps the lights on and keeps me and my colleagues literally employed. Like, I am not getting a cut, or, kind of that kind of thing.
Yeah. So the idea here then is that the most important part for any storyteller, any story coach, anybody facilitating storytelling would be you have to gain trust. And to get that, you have to really be honest with yourself, but also honest with the storytellers you work with about like those institutional cultural hurts that may have occurred or are occurring. So everybody comes to the table, right, with that understanding.
I think so. I think that's totally well said. Because like you're part of an academic institution.
Absolutely. Yep, I am.
Right, like it's bigger than you, and it operates in the world, and like people have ideas and understanding, and they've had experiences with it that I'm sure have been good and life-changing or have been damaging. And when you go out into the world and you ask somebody for something as precious as the story about how much they love their mom, like that might be the biggest gift they could give their community. So what can you do to demonstrate your worthiness to receive that gift and to help them give it? Like, that, which is really how I see it. Like that's the foundational aspect of community building, is like, what can I do, or what do I need to know to be worthy of receiving the gift of your most important story and helping you give that gift to our community so they can receive it.
Love what you're hearing on this podcast? Consider booking me to speak at your next event. Dive further into the transformative power of storytelling with my keynote. Tell better stories, speak up, stand out, and build community. In a world that often amplifies our differences, my talk invites you to embrace genuine connections. Break free from the echo chambers and discover the art of storytelling. Learn how to share your own narrative, listen actively, and foster communities that flourish on shared experiences. Check out the show notes to learn more about how to book a talk for your next event. Absolutely. Thank you for saying that too. I loved the idea of really understanding that every story exchange is precious. I've said like it's sort of humbling. It's humbling a lot of the time. It was as a journalist, but still is, to think about somebody sharing their story, with me, and then having the responsibility, as you know, as a journalist, to craft and curate that story, knowing that like there's this inherent bias. So that's the next thing I also kind of wanted to talk about was when you are, for people specifically who are out there like journalists or people who are sharing an experience or a memory, they have that inherent bias, right? It's that we have our little t truths that these experiences are incredibly powerful, but also seen through our lens, right? We're sharing through our perspective. How do you help people understand like that aspect of storytelling? So in a shorter way to say that we're all seeing things from our own perspectives, which are incredibly valid, right?
Yeah. Okay. So I always position, so I never center myself. I always center the audience in all of my feedback and coaching. So it's like also my like first tip, right, for all coaches is like, try not to say I think, because boy, that is like the best way for somebody to be like, well, no one cares what you think, right?
Yeah.
Like, accurate. You're right. No one does. So, okay.
Yeah.
Now what? So I try to say like, so I'm really clear about the audience I can deliver, because, right, like I have put work into understanding like what is the space I will create and how will I curate the room, and like physically who will be in the room, and do I understand who those people are, right? Like, because you can't coach a story in a vacuum, right? You have to coach a story
Yes.
to an audience. Okay.
Sure.
So if we all understand that, every time I give feedback about something, I say, essentially, I try to imagine like, how will the audience receive this piece of information, and then I start working backwards from, okay, do we have enough time to provide appropriate context for that fact? Number two, does the context help? Like, does it make it easier to receive, or do you have to just like know this person to understand that fact? Is it, then you're asking legal questions, right? Like, is there a public record of it? Did you prosecute? Like, did you call the cops? Is this person out about their sobriety? All these other questions that are sort of like about that person's right to disclose. Then we walk people through the consequences of their disclosure really, really, really clearly. Like, literally, we say things like, if you say this about your dad, it will harm his reputation to the community. Do you want to do that? Right. And like, generally people like, right. And I was like, okay,
Right.
probably leave that in the story. Like, I don't know what
Sure.
to tell you, right? Like, just don't share it.
Right.
And then they'll be like, well, then there is no story. And I'll be like, well, then you can't tell, that you have to come up with a different story. And so I think what I tell people a lot is that, like, I generally, when we were working across America, I would say like, oh, we probably accepted like 97% of all storytellers, but we did not accept 97% of all stories.
Okay.
Of whatever people came in with. And like, the really hard parts of coaching, like the really ugly parts were like, usually then the person didn't move forward and maybe there was like some ill will. And this is like a minuscule fraction, but it would be where like probably somebody was lying to themselves about what happened.
Sure. Yeah.
We're like, and it's not my business. Like, I'm not your mom. I'm not your,
Right.
I'm not your friend. Yeah. So,
yeah.
That's hard in a coaching context. And usually I would end up just saying something like, hey, listen, I see how you see it this way. Do we agree that we can imagine the audience would hear it this way, though? And like, I don't know that we can overcome that barrier. Like, the audience is going to reject this. And like, here's how I know that, right? It's because, but often we just leave stuff out, right? Because people are also like, I'm like, listen, no one needs the whole truth. They need enough of the truth to understand the point of the story.
I love that too, because it correct me if I'm hearing this wrong, Megan, but like, you're really saying, okay, this is about the audience receiving the story, right, as you tell it.
Yes,
so we're
100%.
really thinking about, again, that listening piece, that who's receiving it, what's the purpose. I think that probably comes into why are you telling
100%.
it. Yeah. So that makes sense too. So, and then you typically start there. So when you're coaching somebody, you start with the trust. Then do you move to like, okay, what's our purpose? Who are we speaking to? And what do we want them to receive? Is that typically how you do it, or?
Yeah, that's all in our onboarding. You're exactly right. We say, like, I literally get on the call and I say, the purpose of this call is to help you develop a true first-person story that can be received by a diverse audience in the spirit in which it's intended. And then I literally say, I'm going to unpack that. I say, like, it can't be a myth or a folktale or a legend, and it can't be about your grandfather, right? Like, then we like walk people through the meaning of all those components and help them understand.
Oh, that's great. Yeah. So can you tell me, what have been like your favorite memories or experiences as a story coach, in terms of the things that like moved your heart? Like, what are the things that you've seen?
Oh my God.
This is why I do this.
Megan, you know that. Like,
I know. It's so hard.
No.
Yeah.
I mean, so I've coached more than 3,000 people at this point, and
Wow.
that's a lot of people. But I think, like, very sentimentally, I'm going to tell you something really cheesy. So when I first moved to Phoenix, I was brand new out of college, and I was very lonely, and the other interns left or had boyfriends, and I was just kind of like so alone. And I was like susceptible to loneliness, something I didn't know about myself then, but I know about myself now. Like, I'm very susceptible to feeling lonely. And in the course of my reporting for all these years in Arizona, and then in the course of like more than 1,000 Arizonans have told stories as part of the Arizona Storytellers Project, again, run by the newsroom. Again, I don't want to make it seem like it's just me, like it's run by this institution.
Yeah.
So I now know, like when I go to, and this is really true, like I drive any street in the city and like I know the story of like how that bank was adaptively reused and turned into a cool bar. And I remember when the Super Bowl was here and how I interviewed all those people, or I know the story of the guy who built that apartment complex and how he almost, he thought he was going to lose the whole business and his family was going to have no money because like he tried to build it during the 2008 recession. And all these people have told all these stories, and every time I like literally drive down the street or go to the Grand Canyon, I've done a ton of reporting in the Grand Canyon and I hosted a storytelling event at the Grand Canyon. So my city is so much more than buildings. It truly feels like incredibly personal. Like I know all these stories about all these people who give my community the gift of like their hard work and their inspiration and their heart and their mom, like our food nights are always the best. Like food and family are our best storytelling nights, and our other ones are fashion and beauty.
Oh, I
And
love
food,
that.
yeah, I'm gonna tell you what. Okay, so food you probably understand, right? Like the food we
Absolutely.
eat is the gift of our culture, right? The
Yep,
gift of our
yep.
whoever taught us to cook. The clothes we wear and how we do our hair and how we do our makeup is also deeply and directly tied to our religion, our class, our ethnic heritage, our neighborhood, and probably our closer family and closer friends, the people who we saw often, and we saw how they dressed. So when we tell stories about how we make our bodies look, we are almost always very directly like honoring our culture and our closest family members. And so these are these like deeply moving stories. And it's totally different than how you might think, like, oh, you're doing a fashion and beauty night. Is that just going to be a bunch of people talking about Vogue? Or like, what on earth are people going to say? Like, nobody goes to fashion shows, or like, people do, but you know what I'm saying?
Yeah,
And instead,
yeah.
it's not that at all. It's just like stories about like, my grandma always wore these earrings, and when she gave them to me, blah, blah, blah.
Okay, I'm gonna pause just for a second. So this, like, I have this on. I don't know if you can see it. This was my
Yeah,
grandma.
yeah.
She passed away, and I wear it when I'm having a big day or a busy day to remind me that like she was an amazing woman who stood up in her time.
Oh my
And so I'm
God.
always, you're saying that, and I'm like, oh my gosh, absolutely. I feel like she's kind of
Yeah.
with me, or I'm carrying on her legacy
All
in
the
a way.
time.
So
All the time.
yeah,
Yeah.
that's incredible. You said something too that really I love. As someone who's uniquely positioned to like hear stories and facilitate storytelling, you stayed in the same place, right, since college. So you've been there a long time. You've had time to know the community in a way that probably not a lot of people know the community. So I'm interested in, do you have advice for people who may not be journalists, so they may not have that excuse to go out and ask for stories, but maybe they're in public relations or maybe they're in marketing? Like, what can they do? And this could be very practical. What can they do to like build those relationships, to like figure out opportunities for story exchange so that they can have like what you described was such a beautiful relationship, in terms of knowing your community?
Yeah. I mean, I think like, it depends. It depends like I always work backwards from the result or the end product. So it's like,
Okay.
why?
Yeah.
Because it's just really like the first thing people say is like, what are you going to do with my story? And I'm like,
Right.
well, I'm going to put it on the internet. Hopefully thousands of people will watch it. Right. Like,
Yeah.
or whatever.
Sure.
Or like, no, I'm not going to sell the rights. We have like a release form. It says like, I'm not going to sell the rights to your personal story to HBO or whatever that is.
Right.
But I think like, oral storytelling is obviously flourishing across the country. There are people
Yes.
running nights, probably most reasonably sized cities have 5 to a dozen storytelling nights that vary in tone and audience and like the work those nights want to do, right? Like sometimes it could just be like healing and catharsis, or sometimes it could just be like funny and entertaining or whatever, right? Or they're spiritually based, right? Where people are doing storytelling out of their church. So, I think like for people who want to start building relationships with their community or understanding their community that way, I would like Google it and be like, oh, does that group need a volunteer, or is there an opportunity for me to like, how do I get involved in this? I think learning how to be a listener and a coach, like I was mentored by Liz Warren is the founder and still the director of the South Mountain Community College Storytelling Institute. And her number 2 is a woman named Marilyn Omofunke Torres. And she and Liz they're both academics who are anthropologists and educators. And so like they teach truly, right, like at the semester after semester, they teach people how to tell personal stories, folk tales, healing stories, myths, legends, all of it, business stories, whatever. So they didn't like say, here's how to run a national storytelling collective at your journalism job, but they were like, I remember always like I met with Marilyn at this cafe, and I remember when she looked at me and she was like, okay, the most important thing is emotional safety for the storyteller and emotional safety for the audience. And I was like, oh, those aren't values in journalism. Like, we don't want to harm people, but the news is upsetting. And so it is, right?
Yeah.
Wow. So I had to like design processes and theories and tap into values. And like, I had to work backwards to be like, well, what does it look like if a newsroom is trauma informed and culturally competent and seeks not to harm? What does that look like? And I had to invent that.
Okay, we had to pause the podcast to let you in on this opportunity. If you're ready to elevate your brand storytelling, don't miss our training, Tell Better Stories, led by me, a seasoned television journalist and PR professor, and Kyle, an on-air meteorologist and video storytelling expert. This workshop unveils our secrets to craft compelling, personal-driven narratives that resonate with your audience. Learn our distinct approach that puts people first and brands second, leveraging 6 storytelling elements for maximum impact. Walk away with actionable strategies, tactics, and a clear process to replicate success in any organization. Check out the show notes to learn more about this offer or reach out to Homeplace. Other conversations that I've had, Megan, a theme that I've heard has been both parties in any story exchange need to come to the table willing to listen with open hearts, was how it's been described. And you just described that. How did you... what are things that you've encountered or things that you just feel like people might not necessarily always think about when you're talking about emotional safety for both the audience and the storyteller? I know we talked about some of those at the beginning of the conversation, but I just want to make sure that, like, are there any hiccups that you've seen like over and over again that people might not obviously think of, but that they could avoid?
I mean, okay, so like, I think, so if you're just getting into this, or you're like, oh, do I want to do it, or am I interested in doing it, or even, I don't know, even if you're like very sophisticated about it, I guess, like,
sure,
the
you might not know these things.
The things I think about a lot are, you have to prepare the storyteller to be successful. So like I think you can't just like, so I believe in like a lot of rigor and boundary setting, or sort of like space holding, because it's so easy to like slide into a inappropriately intimate or confessional or therapeutic conversation with a person telling a story. And that's not appropriate. And I'm not trained in those things, right?
Sure.
And so to keep that, to protect us both from the harm that could result from a slide into that kind of conversation, that's why I have like a 25 bullet point script of like, this is who I am. This is what I am here to do. These are the things that inform the process. This is how the process will go. These are our rules. And so our first 3 rules are, you can't say anything that, and this was from Marilyn, this is what she said, cannot damage your relationship with your job, your family, or your community. Number 2, you cannot besmirch another person's reputation, even if you do not name them or describe them closely. If people could triangulate it, it's got to go. Because we're not going to like destroy your brother's life for a community storytelling event, right? Like,
sure.
Okay. And then number 3, I did learn the hard way. Like, keep it PG-13. Like, I curse a lot in my personal life, but I don't curse a lot on stage, and I don't use inflammatory words. And the reason you don't do that on stage is because shocking people actually makes their hearts close up, right? And like, nobody wants to be shocked unless I've sold you shocking and then you bought a ticket to something shocking, but I am not advertising this as a shocking experience. And so I don't want to shock you. I want to keep your heart open. And so I need you not to use salacious or shocking language. Now, that doesn't mean we can't talk about hard things. Obviously, we've talked about like death and war and trauma and things that went terribly and frightening. And, you know, every topic that you'd see in the newspaper is also on our stages, but we're just not being gratuitous about the language choices. And we do use trigger warnings. Like that's another thing that maybe regular storytelling events don't do, or I don't know how often that's done, but like that's part of journalism. So we would do trigger warnings as part of our care for the audience. We also vet stories for like, if you bought a ticket to this theme, would you expect this story?
Oh.
So like, right. An example was like once we had a woman pitch us for Love and Heartbreak, a story about essentially being groomed. And she was like she got out of that situation and she'd done all the therapy and now she was like a much older adult woman and had healed. Okay. And even though it was a very good story and she was competent to tell it, I think spiritually and emotionally, like she had processed it and it felt safe to hear. It wasn't what you'd expect of a Valentine's Day storytelling event on like, February 12th.
Sure. Yeah.
And so we just kind of had to say like, technically this does fit the theme, but it doesn't fit the audience's expectations. And I'm right. Like,
yeah.
So
that's a great example.
So those are, yeah, thanks. But like, so those are some examples of like other things I think about keeping the audience safe or like emotional safety. We had like stories, we had 5 stories that I thought were sort of, they weren't, you cannot tell, but I told everybody from the start, when you get pitched these 5 kinds of stories, they're going to be incredibly involved to coach, like both in time and labor and skill. And so those were, stories about addiction and recovery tend to be lifelong narratives. So they're hard to get short. And they involve a lot of trauma and harm often. So like, I was thinking, again, you can't tell it. I was just like, oh, it's going to be a lot of work, generally speaking.
Yeah.
Stories about miraculous recoveries. Sometimes you don't want to ever lift up a narrative that was like, I prayed to God, and so God protected me. And then, like, obviously God doesn't answer all of our prayers. So you have to coach that story to be about something that can include faith. But the point of the story can't be, if you pray, you get what you want, because we know that is not objectively true. People pray all the time very ardently and they don't get what they want. So how can you coach that story to be received by other prayerful people who have not gotten what they wanted? Stories about getting high or drunk are hard to coach because I think most of the time we don't learn from those moments. So I'm like, what is the point of the story? Just make sure there's a point. It can't just be like, that shit was crazy. I think abortion stories, because Americans, I think, disagree on the meaning of that process. I think like Americans, we know statistically speaking, agree it should be legal, but I think not everybody agrees that it's fine. And so I think it's really hard to keep your storyteller safe in the room. If you kind of know, objectively speaking, that like the room could be split 50-50, like this is fine, or this is very, very, very bad. And so again, I'm not saying you can't do it. I'm just like, you have to know what room you're, like, who's in the room. Are you co-producing the event with Planned Parenthood? Probably great. They have a series of nights called Shout Your Abortion. I'd be like, great, that's going to be just fine. But like, if you're co-producing the night with like the library, your room's probably going to be more mixed. Anyway, so like, as you can hear, and then straight up just stories about like trauma, right? Abuse. Right. Like, and so we're not like no hard pass. We're just really like, okay, that could take 3 months to coach that person, or that could take a more skilled coach and more time and more hand holding about the process and, yada, yada, yada.
Yeah. No, and I appreciate you. Thank you for giving those practical examples, because I think that, it's funny because as you were talking about number 3, I have also learned the hard way about number 3. So I think that there are like lots of things to consider, when you're telling a story. And I would be curious for storytellers. So people who are maybe listening to this and are like, okay, I feel like confident about, thinking through these emotionally healthy things that I can do for audience and storyteller. What about protecting yourself as a storyteller? So if you're in a situation where you feel potentially uncomfortable, or maybe someone's asking you to share a story and there's a power differentiation. I'm just thinking, for example, like maybe you're at work and someone's like, oh, we'd love you to tell this story to this, committee or whatever. And you don't feel comfortable. Do you have advice for people in terms of like asserting themselves in a situation where maybe they're being pushed by a coach or a person in power to share a story that they don't feel comfortable sharing, or aspects of a story they don't feel comfortable sharing? Like, have you encountered that, and like what would you say to people who need that kind of help?
Oh my God, yeah, that's such a good question. Truly, 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 because I think that vulnerability is a con. You might think, oh, I can just like be myself all the time. And like,
Yeah.
what I know is that like, and everyone's like, oh, real stories have real vulnerability. And I'm like, yeah, girl, they do, but they're coached. Like, so I would say anytime somebody's like pushing you to quote unquote be vulnerable, I would really, really say like only the most powerful person in the room can be the most vulnerable. And the less status or power you have by your age, your education, your class, your identity groups, like you have less protection in your vulnerability. And so one of the things I teach, I teach a session on like basically how to think about self-disclosure prior to self-disclosing. Um, is to say like we all want to share different parts of ourselves, and those have different threat levels. So like I worked with a journalist once who was hosting a podcast, and she kind of like didn't want to know, she didn't want people to know some very specific aspect about her. And like, if you know her first and last name, you might guess at these identity markers. This is like me, she has an ethnic name. My name is Megan Finnerty. If you were like, are you Irish Catholic? I would be like, yes. And that would not be a surprise to people who are familiar with Irish Americans. So she had a name like mine that could make you guess at sort of where her family's from in the world and perhaps what religion they are. And she felt like she didn't want people to know or think about those things. And because she hadn't like totally articulated these aspects of herself and realized like, so she just had like fear about them. And so they sort of sprawled in her mind. And instead we just kind of said like, well, okay, we're going to make a list of things you talk about and things you don't talk about. And that's it. And then now you know. If you get dragged into X, you already know. You're just like, oh, I don't talk about X in public.
Right.
I'm just not interested in it. And that's your prerogative.
Absolutely. You said earlier boundaries, right? That's where you start, is with those rules. But you can make those personally as well. I think that's a good piece of advice too, because I teach a class in personal branding, and students ask that question a lot. They'll say, what should I share and where should I share it? Because I think a lot of the conversation around storytelling now is, like you said, just be vulnerable, just be yourself, show up. But there are repercussions, right? Of that. And like you just said it, depending on where you're at and your status, like you will be perceived a certain way. And we all know that especially I'm thinking in terms of like personal branding, you're a curated brand. That's not who you are. I always try to point that out. Like that's not you. That's a curation of you. It's a persona. So I really appreciate that advice. And then thinking through like, yeah, it's okay to say this is off limits, right? We don't have to talk about this, or we do want to be perceived this way so we can tell a story this way. And so,
I'm super interested in this topic. I'm obsessed with it too. I love that you teach a whole class on personal branding, because it's like people in journalism think it's gross. And I was like, but now it's like such a huge part of your job. Like I think figured it out.
Yep.
But I had a really powerful experience with this at work once when we had like a employee resource group, right? An ERG was about mental health, and a colleague I knew casually and several others like disclosed that they had been diagnosed with certain types of mental, I guess you would say mental illness, but I also don't think that's not always accurate. So but they had diagnoses about the ways their brain works. And they had experienced crises and at varying levels. Like some people certainly took medication, other people disclosed that they had actually like sought inpatient care, et cetera, et cetera. And all this was part of the ERG, just like if you had any other like women's ERG would talk about like balancing life work priorities maybe for moms. Like, okay, so all of this is very normal. It's very corporate. It's on the Zoom screen. And I found myself being like, oh my God, I wouldn't talk about that at work, because I would be afraid that this, even though I know the company respects my labor, like, would they judge me? And would that cost me future opportunities? And I found what they were doing to be really like brave and powerful. And then when I logged off, I was like, oh, I have hangups about those topics. I experience shame and fear. They are emancipated. They are they are liberated from the consequences of these disclosures because they have like transcended that because they've done the work, and like I have not done the work.
Yeah.
Or that's how it made me feel. Like I
Yeah.
have stigma and stereotype about these ideas.
Sure.
And that's my job to deal with
Yeah.
those feelings and to
Right.
unpack those ideas.
Yes. Yeah. I love that you use that example. I've had similar situations over and over again where, you know, I think it's human nature, depending on what information people give us, you know, the opposite of that is like sometimes we'll assume something about them and then they'll share a story, they'll be vulnerable, and we'll be like, oh, wow, I didn't know that, right? And that makes me now think of you in a whole different light, right? It can be positive or negative. I guess it's a double-edged sword.
Yeah.
But I'm curious to know what you would say about like the public explosion of, because I'm, again, going back to like, I've been studying storytelling, like you've been a journalist, been at this for a long time. And I feel like the conversations, at least that I hear now, are like, oh, just get out there. Just, and when I think about that on a social media platform where, again, you don't really have any control over the audience, you don't have you're kind of relinquishing the control of where that story will go and how it will be perceived. I wonder if you would give anybody caution about that, right? Or thoughts about if you coach people through, like, again, how do you draw that line, draw that personal boundary around what you feel comfortable letting go out into the world and what you might want to hold a little bit closer?
I tell everybody, like, don't make that decision in the moment. Like, talk
Yeah.
about it with others. Like if you know it's going to come up, or you know it's an aspect of yourself that is not always accepted by others, good or bad. Like, it's not you. And I try to say that like without judgment. Like, people,
Sure.
everybody's on the right. Like, I was processing my ideas about these aspects of other people's identities and trying to be like self-aware of it, because that's where I am in my journey about that topic. Like, I can't, right. And so anyway, my whole thing is like, do the thinking before you're on the spot. Talk to people you trust who are probably, one of them should be older than you.
Great advice.
Because people judging you are going to be different ages and from different backgrounds. And I mean, ultimately, like, it's up to you how much you care, or how much you care about like, all we ever can do as story coaches is say like, hey, these are the foreseeable consequences that I can imagine. That's right. Like, I can't decide whether or not you should take those chances.
Right.
But I have decided that I was unwilling to take a chance on someone. Like I said, like, I think it's too dangerous for you to disclose this, and we're not going to be part of it. I think it's going to hurt you. And it's like, I'm not going to move forward with this coaching experience. And that's happened twice.
Okay.
Again, we're
right?
like
3,000, two out of 3,000.
Like 6,000 total for the project. But for me personally, I was like, twice a person was really insistent that it was safe and good and right. And I was like, and that's different, by the way. What they were disclosing is different from ready to tell. Like, obviously we've had a lot of people where I was like, I think you're still grieving your husband, or I think you're still, you know, grieving this loss. Like, that's a much higher number of people. But like, actually somebody wanting to disclose a thing where I was like, I think it's a bad look for everybody, and I'm not gonna, you know, that's much lower. I think people, but also I think it's so much about the audience, because like, I was also experiencing in that moment with the ERG that like, I was older, and right, like, I had kind of grown up in a time when I had ideas about this that were negative, and I was unpacking those. And these people many of them were from at least 10 years younger than me, and they had different ideas about what was appropriate and what they had worked for, you know. So I think for people also, and as you teach this class, the Maynard Institute, are you familiar with their fault lines?
I'm not, no.
Okay, so they're geniuses, like, giving credit where credit's due. The Maynard Institute been doing the Lord's work for years, like truly decades and decades. Their fault lines are the ways through which communication breaks down between people and misunderstanding happens, and they teach that you have to communicate across class, race, gender, geography, generation, and LGBTQ status has been added in the last like maybe 10 years or so. And what that means is that you have to know, as the speaker and the listener, that when you use certain words and ideas, they don't move across those lines. You have to make sure you know what that person thinks you mean based on their age, based on what that part of the country they come from, and, you know, that kind of thing.
Sure.
And so when we coach, we like talk about that too, as like, this has come up. Like, I had a storyteller want to tell a story basically about how like white women are the worst because we're racist and we're ruining his life. And I was like, you know what? That's probably true. Like, yes, great. Like, let's assume it's true.
Yeah,
Okay.
right.
Like, I'm not going to argue it's not, because like the math would back this up. So, but I was like, hey man, your audience in Phoenix is going to be like more white than not. Like, we have a relatively low black population relative to our Hispanic population and our white populations. So I was like, okay, if I know the room is like probably 50% women and like more white than not, although not overwhelmingly so, how do we coach a story so it can be received by those women? And so we talked about like the point of his story could remain, but I was like,
Sure.
what will be like how will we talk across these default lines so it can be received by these women and they can do something with it and not just feel like yelled at a storytelling event.
Right.
And like, he understood. He was like, okay, let's talk about it.
Yeah.
Right. Like, great. Because I didn't make it about him or me, and I didn't make it about the topic. I was just more like, how do we tell this story successfully so they can hear it and internalize it or whatever.
Absolutely. That's the best advice, right? It seems so simple to hear you say it, but I appreciate that. I think that's a great example. And again, it goes back to like the first point you made, which is like, consider the audience, right? Consider your listeners, but also like consider your purpose. Like, we want you want to protect the storyteller too, right? We want to, help make sure that, I think too, kind of going into my next question, Megan, would be like, we really want to inspire like change. Like, I think when I think about storytelling can bridge, like connect individuals, so like create those relationships, and then you can think about how they can really help us have conversations about how we can better our communities. And that, you said this earlier, when you know everybody in the community, right? When you know that story of that building and you know that person knows this there, you really your behavior will change because you know, or you feel that relationship to other people. And I think that's something that we've lost to people as people have moved away, right? I know when I study storytelling, they always talk about how in the old days people would sit on the porch, or they would be out, or they would be swapping these stories just very naturally, and maybe we've lost some of that over time. So I'm really interested in, how are you thinking through, and I don't know if this is part of your work or has been, community change. I don't know if I'm asking this in like the most straightforward way, but how does storytelling help us create tangible community change? Because I've studied it, I see that it does, but I'm interested to hear your perspective on that.
Well, it's definitely like, I feel like it's hard. I definitely started the Storytellers Project truly from a place of, at first I was just really like, it will make people feel less alone physically because they like come to a show, but it will make people feel less alone intellectually because they'll know they're not alone in this thought. They're not alone in this experience. And then as we scaled it or used it sort of as a tool in journalism, like its value proposition is explicitly like oral storytelling to create empathy and support democracy. Like very, like that's the North Star of the project. I think it's been sobering. Like, I don't have an answer to why. I mean, okay, I'll answer that question in like two ways, and one sort of happy and one's not happy.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
Okay, so like on the not happy side, obviously this flourishing of oral storytelling evenings across America in the last 15 years has not stemmed the tide of like partisan cruelty and people's deep spiritual loneliness. I live in a community that like is very divided, I think. Like if you look at Arizona's elections, like we're turning more blue, but it's pretty contentious. And So I might look at me and say, I don't know, Megan, you've been doing this for 12 years in Phoenix and like, doesn't look better from where I sit. Like, it's not kumbaya. Like, everybody likes each other more because 1,000 of you got on stage. And I mean, more than 100,000 people have bought tickets across the country to these nights that my team and I helped facilitate at the USA, at Gannett. And like, I don't know, like, did I make America better? Like, so, and that's not my job. Like, that's also the church's job, whatever church or mosque or congregation, like, it's not on me, but I know that was my value proposition. Like, that was in my heart. That is what I talk to people about. And, we put in place anti-racism behavior before I learned that word. So in 2017, I did a survey of like how many people of color were on our stages. It was 22%. In 2018, I worked with my right hand, Michelle Rogers, who's like moved on to a different job, but she and I designed a set of best practices, behaviors, and language that would encourage people to consciously book against identities, so that we were looking at who was on our stage and how did that compare to the census data for each of our communities, and how did that also compare to the news judgment, like the areas of issues that might be growing but wouldn't be reflected in the census data. So for example, Phoenix is 20% foreign born. So 1 out of 5 storytellers should be an immigrant or probably the child of an immigrant, because that, okay. Or we knew like X percentage of the community makes this salary, X percentage of the community is from this identity group, X percentage is LGBTQ or this age. So we ended up making a list of 9 identity metrics, including previously incarcerated, veteran status, and then kind of miscellaneous, like, have you been homeless? Have you experienced a mental health crisis? Not just age, gender. Okay. So that had a meaningful change. We also wrote a note and we asked people to self-identify. It wasn't contingent on your participation, and we didn't compel you. We just asked you to do it. We had 2/3 participation, and we moved the needle on people of color to 47% in like 2 years. So yeah, like, mission accomplished, right? Like, you tell people to do something, you provide a process for them to do that thing, you track it. As Atul Gawande writes in all of his books, like, find something, measure it, track it, you can improve it. So I know like tactically we did the work to create a diverse and inclusive environment where people could be exposed to stories of those unlike their own background. And that is what you can do, is you can control your input. I think the positive answer to your question, not just to be like such a sad sack Sally, is I think the reason there is so much storytelling in America, and I give credit to my mentor, Liz Warren, in this answer, is like, when she and I were like, why is this flourishing? Like, people ask that a lot when I started the project. Like, everybody's like, is it because we're all on our cell phones all the time? And Liz observed that no, because then it would be happening globally. Like, then this sort of oral narrative sharing about your personal life would be happening in every other country that has so many cell phones. And you don't see that, like, it's not quite happening at this level everywhere. And she developed this idea that I feel is really true, empirically, you would have to study it, Meg, and tell me if it's true, is that as we participate in less homogenous spaces, we need to connect over personal stories, because we cannot connect over master narratives. I grew up in Indiana. I didn't know any indigenous people, but I then moved out to the West, and it made me totally question, like, manifest destiny. It made me question the use of the word pioneer as a positive. Like, that was mind-blowing. I was like, oh, pioneer, not always a good thing. Interesting word. Okay. Like, I wouldn't have known that in where I'm from. And so then you say, well, then, like, the story of pioneers traveling west is a story that moves through certain cultures, but not all. And if it doesn't move through my community advantageously, then, like, what other stories do I have? Yeah, I mean, my dream, I guess, or like our work, your and I's next work, and I mean, I guess this is a thing I'd love to talk to more current practitioners about, is like, I don't know. Like, we know that we coach stories across like universal theme. We celebrate universal themes is kind of what I talk to people about, right? So, okay, generosity, forgiveness, family, love. Yeah. All those words, right? Like, stories that I always say, like, you're modeling a pro-social behavior, modeling pro-social behavior in your story. Okay, But like, that's right. Like, so when somebody does the right thing in the story, modeling pro-social behavior. What I've started to think about is for our communities of geography and our communities of interest, what can we start finding and sharing stories that can replace some of the other master narratives that are more helpful, more specific, and more relevant? And so you see this work being done in like sort of community narrative facilitation, where, you know, I'm still pretty invested in like idiosyncratic personal stories to create like fun and insight and charm and wit and surprise and all that fun stuff. But I wonder about the future of like, what is the future of how we co-create our city's story, our neighborhood's story? How can we feel reconnected to each other? Like, if part of the trauma of this process that you and I are living through is the ripping apart of master narratives that used to connect us and the harm that they have created, what other stories, like, we have to replace it with something that reconnects us. And I think we aren't there. I think we could be 100 years from there. We could be 200 years from there. Like, I will offer you this, right? Like, I'm a practicing Catholic, which constantly surprises people because I'm a fairly like progressive person interested in the enfranchisement of all, is how I phrase it. And like, you know, like curse all the time and whatever. But my faith is super important to me. And so I know, right, like that the stories of the church are harmful to many and like people are not really interested in it. And like the church is bound up in colonialism and even like creation of like the separation of the genders as a mechanism of harm and control, which, like, again, unpacking all this shit for myself. But I'm like, and God, not even to like talk about the other problems with child sexual abuse. And so all those are pretty big stories, and they're all trending in the wrong direction. And I'm like, okay, is there a narrative about, like, is there a future in which we have any other stories about the church? And I'm just using this as one example, obviously, like, just, you know, we could multiply this out for every institution. So like, what are the examples, or like, what are the future stories about this institution that 1 billion people on the planet are nominally participating in, that can reconnect us and help not disappear the harm, but like help, I don't know, apologize for the harm or move forward with the harm. And maybe, I have no idea, maybe that's not a storytelling problem. Maybe that is a problem that has to be fixed by, I mean, I assume like an apology tour and a reconciliation tour and maybe reparations of some kind, land returning. But I don't know, Megan, these are the things I think of, because I'm just like, God, if we stop telling all these one stories, do we become, I don't know, is the future of our culture one that doesn't have as many master narratives and they're just like a mix of personal stories? And like, maybe yes, but I think that's why people like sports teams, is because they give you like one unifying story for the whole city, and that feels good. And I'm like, what else is like that? Or how could we as storytellers be part of a story creation that's unifying and franchising for more people?
We're so glad you've listened to this podcast episode. If you liked it, would you mind doing us a favor? Share this episode with someone who would be interested in the topic too. We're on a mission to help everyone become a better storyteller. And don't forget to subscribe to the show to get updated every time we release a new episode. Each and every episode is produced, hosted, and edited by us, Megan Kyle Adams at Home Place Creative. Happy storytelling!